My name is Annika. I was 19 when my mother remarried, and I never imagined this story would unfold the way it did. The heart, though, has a way of defying plans, pulling you into currents you never meant to swim. This is a tale woven with emotions I didn't ask for, emotions I fought against but couldn't deny. They were raw, undeniable, and true, no matter how much I wished they weren't. Telling this story feels like peeling back layers of my own skin, but it's the truth, and the truth demands to be spoken. Before Elias came into our lives, my world was a quiet, salt-tinged corner of a small coastal town called Haven's End. It was just me and my mother, Clara, in our weathered clapboard house perched on a bluff overlooking the grey Atlantic. My father had died when I was 16, struck down by a sudden heart attack that left a jagged hole in our lives. His absence was a storm that never passed, leaving the air in our home heavy with unspoken grief. The garden he'd loved, bursting with wild roses and lavender, withered under my neglect, the petals curling brown and brittle, mirroring the dull ache in my chest. My father had been my anchor, the one who taught me to sketch the horizon, to trace the curves of seashells with charcoal, to find beauty in the ordinary. Without him, the world lost its colour. Clara worked endless shifts as a nurse at the local clinic, her hands always steady but her eyes carrying a quiet sorrow. She'd leave before dawn, her footsteps soft on the creaky floorboards, and return long after the gulls had settled for the night. Even exhausted, she'd muster a smile for me, a fragile, brave thing that never quite reached the shadows beneath her eyes. I loved her fiercely and wanted nothing more than to see her whole again, but her pain was a tide that ebbed and flowed, much like my own. At the community college, I threw myself into art. Drawing was my refuge, my way of speaking when words failed. Grief poured onto the canvas in stormy greys and deep indigos. On rare days when joy flickered, I'd sketch in vibrant golds and blues, capturing the ocean's fleeting sparkle. But for years after my father's death, my work was all shadow, heavy with the weight of loss. One late autumn evening, everything shifted. The air smelled of salt and impending rain as Clara came home, her coat damp from the mist rolling off the sea. I was at the kitchen table, sketching the jagged cliffs outside our window, when I caught her expression. She wasn't just weary, she was radiant, her cheeks flushed, her eyes alight with something I hadn't seen in years. She set her bag down and called me to the living room, her voice soft but trembling with something new. "Annika," she said, sitting on the faded couch, her hands twisting nervously in her lap, "I need to tell you something." My stomach tightened. Her tone was unfamiliar, laced with both excitement and caution. "What is it?" I asked, my pencil still in hand, the sketch forgotten. "I've met someone," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "His name is Elias. He's kind, Annika, a good man." The words hit like a wave breaking on the shore. My mother hadn't so much as looked at another man since my father's death. I didn't know how to respond, so I asked the only thing that felt safe. "Does he make you happy, Mom?" Her face softened and her eyes shimmered like the sea under moonlight. "Yes, sweetheart, he does." That was enough for me. If Clara could find light again, I wouldn't stand in her way. "Then I'm happy for you," I said, forcing a smile despite the knot in my chest. A week later, I met Elias. He came to our house for dinner on a chilly evening, the wind howling outside, rattling the windows. I'd spent the day packing, my nerves fraying at the thought of this stranger stepping into our lives. What if he was cold? What if he tried to replace my father? When the doorbell rang, I froze, my heart pounding as Clara rushed to answer it. I stood in the kitchen, clutching a glass of water, and watched as Elias stepped inside. He was tall, with broad shoulders and eyes the colour of the sky just before a storm, grey-blue and steady. His dark hair was threaded with silver, and his smile was warm, crinkling the corners of his eyes. He wore a wool sweater that smelled faintly of cedar, and his presence seemed to fill the room without overwhelming it. "Annika," he said, his voice low and grounded like the rumble of distant waves. "It's so good to finally meet you. Clara's told me so much about you." I managed a shy smile, my grip tightening on the glass. "Nice to meet you too," I said, my voice smaller than I intended. Dinner was surprisingly easy. The table was set with Clara's old blue china, and the smell of roasted cod and garlic potatoes filled the air. Elias didn't try to act like my father or force a connection. He was just himself. He asked about my art, my classes, my dreams, and he listened, really listened, his eyes never straying as I described the way I tried to capture the ocean's moods in my sketches. It reminded me of my father, the way he'd sit with me on the bluff, asking about my day with that same quiet attention. The memory stirred something warm and fragile in me, something I hadn't felt in years. As the weeks passed, Elias became a steady presence. He'd stop by with fresh coffee for Clara, or he'd sit with us on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in pinks and purples. Clara's laughter returned, bright and unguarded, and she seemed younger, as if the weight of grief had lifted just enough for her to breathe. I watched her bloom again, like the roses in the garden that had begun to bud once more. And yet beneath my happiness for her, something else stirred. Feelings I didn't understand, feelings I wasn't ready to name. The house, once a silent shell, began to hum with life again. Clara's laughter mingled with Elias' low chuckles, filling the rooms with a warmth that felt like the first rays of sun after a long winter. The creak of the porch swing, the clink of dishes at dinner, the soft murmur of their voices late at night. It was a melody of hope, a song I hadn't heard since my father was alive. 6 months after that first dinner, Clara sat me down on the faded couch in our living room, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Elias stood beside her, his steady presence anchoring the moment. "Annika," she said, her voice trembling with joy, "we're getting married." Her eyes sparkled like the sea at noon, and I could see the love radiating from her, as if Elias had reignited a flame that had long been dimmed. I looked at him, and he met my gaze with a gentle nod, his grey-blue eyes kind but not presumptuous. "I'm so happy for you both," I said, and I meant it. Elias had brought light back to Clara, and his respect for me, his careful distance from any role that wasn't his, made it easy to wish them well. The wedding was held in our backyard, where the wild roses had begun to bloom again, their petals soft against the salt-worn fence. It was a bright June day, the sun warming the grass, the sky stretching endlessly blue above the cliffs. Clara wore a simple white dress that flowed like sea foam, her auburn hair catching the light, making her look like the young woman in old photos from before I was born. Elias gazed at her as if she were the horizon itself, the only thing worth seeing. I stood near the garden, clutching a bouquet of lavender, my heart torn between gratitude for her happiness and the sharp pang of missing my father. After the wedding, Elias moved into our clapboard house. Life shifted like the tide reshaping the shore. It was no longer just Clara and me, our quiet duo navigating grief. We were a family of 3, a new constellation I hadn't expected. At first it felt strange, his heavy footsteps on the stairs each morning, his cedar-scented sweater draped over the armchair, his coffee mug beside Clara's on the counter. But Elias was careful, almost meticulous, in respecting my space. He knocked before entering my room, never pried into my silences, and never tried to fill the void my father left. He was just Elias, steady and kind, a man who seemed to understand the fragility of our healing. For a while everything felt normal, or as normal as it could be. But then, like ripples spreading across still water, small moments began to surface, moments so subtle I barely noticed them at first. One afternoon I was in the kitchen, balancing precariously on a chair to reach a box of tea on a high shelf. My fingers grazed the edge, but it was just out of reach. "Here, let me," came a calm voice behind me. I turned to see Elias, his tall frame filling the doorway. He stepped forward, reached up effortlessly, and handed me the box, his fingers brushing mine for the briefest moment. "Thank you," I said, my voice quick, almost sharp. "No problem," he replied, his smile warm, crinkling the corners of his eyes. But as he stood close, the scent of cedar and sea air clinging to him, I felt a strange flutter in my chest. My heart beat faster, unmoored. I told myself it was nothing, just surprise, just gratitude. I pushed the feeling down, buried it beneath the sound of the waves outside, and turned away. Another day my old car sputtered and refused to start, its engine coughing in the driveway as I panicked. I was already late for an art class, my portfolio half finished, and frustration prickled at my eyes. Elias appeared, wiping his hands on a rag, his brow furrowed with concern. "What's wrong, Annika?" he asked, his voice steady despite my near tears. "The car won't start," I said, my voice breaking. He opened the hood, his movements calm and practiced, and after a few minutes of tinkering he nodded. "Try it now." I turned the key and the engine roared to life. Relief flooded me, washing away the panic. "Oh my gosh, Elias, thank you, you saved me," I said, and without thinking I threw my arms around him in a quick, grateful hug. His warmth, the solidness of him, felt like a harbor in a storm. For a moment I felt safe, utterly, impossibly safe, the way I had when my father would pull me close during a thunderstorm. The realization hit like a wave, and I pulled back, my cheeks burning. Elias just smiled as if nothing had changed and said, "Anytime." But inside me, something dangerous had stirred, a spark I didn't want to name. The house grew quieter after that, not because of Clara or Elias, but because of me. I couldn't shake the memory of that hug, the way his presence had felt like an anchor. I told myself it was nothing, a fleeting moment, a trick of my grief-stricken heart, but the feeling lingered, heavy as the fog that rolled in from the sea. Elias was my mother's husband, my stepfather. To feel anything beyond respect for him was wrong, unthinkable. I repeated this to myself like a mantra, but my heart was a traitor, whispering truths I didn't want to hear. The small moments kept coming, each one a pebble adding to the weight in my chest. Elias and I discovered a shared love for old black and white films, the kind Clara found tedious. One evening when she was out with friends, he knocked on the doorframe of the living room holding a bowl of popcorn. "There's a classic on tonight," he said, his voice casual. "Want to watch?" I hesitated, then nodded, maybe too eagerly. We sat on the couch, the flickering screen casting shadows across the room. We laughed at the same lines, quoted the same actors, and for a while it felt simple, like sharing a moment with a friend. But during a quiet scene, a character's loss mirrored my own and tears slipped down my cheeks. I wiped them away quickly, hoping Elias wouldn't notice, but he did. Without a word, he passed me a tissue, his fingers brushing mine for a fleeting second. The touch sent a jolt through me, electric and terrifying. My heart raced, but Elias kept his eyes on the screen, calm as always. I prayed he hadn't felt it, that the fire was only in me. Those moments piled up, each one sharpening the ache I tried to ignore. When Clara worked late shifts, Elias and I often found ourselves alone in the house. In the kitchen, as he chopped vegetables for dinner, we'd talk about my art, my dreams of creating something that could speak for me, something that could capture the wildness of the sea. He shared stories of his work as an architect, describing the buildings he designed with a quiet passion that made me see them in my mind, sweeping lines, glass that caught the light like water. He remembered the smallest details, the name of my art professor, the painting I'd struggled with, the book I'd mentioned in passing. His attention was a tide, pulling me closer despite my resistance. One Saturday I was in the garage, wrestling with a canvas for a school project. The colors refused to blend, the shapes felt lifeless, and frustration boiled inside me. I hurled my brush to the floor, its clatter echoing in the dim space. "It's not working," I muttered, my voice thick with defeat. Elias appeared in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the soft light of the setting sun. He stepped inside, studying the canvas in silence. "What are you trying to say with this?" he asked, his voice soft but probing. I poured out my vision, my failure, my fear that I'd never create anything worthwhile. He listened, his eyes steady, and then said, "Sometimes you're too close to see it clearly. Art needs room to breathe, Annika. Let's take a walk." I wanted to refuse to stay in my frustration, but his calm gaze unraveled my resolve. We walked to the nearby park where the air was cool and heavy with the scent of pine and salt. The trees swayed in the breeze, their leaves whispering secrets. Elias shared a story from his youth, about a design he'd agonized over until he stepped away and saw it anew. His words were like a lighthouse, guiding me through the fog of my own doubts. When we returned, I looked at my canvas and saw the path forward, as if the walk had cleared the storm in my mind. "Thank you, Elias," I whispered, my voice barely audible. He smiled, and in that moment I realized with a sickening clarity that I wasn't just grateful. I wasn't just glad he was part of our family. I was falling in love with him. The realization was a wound, sharp and deep. He was Clara's husband, my stepfather. The wrongness of it churned in my stomach, but the feeling grew stronger, a current I couldn't swim against. I started avoiding him, retreating to my room when he was in the kitchen, escaping to the library when he watched TV. The house, once alive with laughter, grew quiet again, heavy with my silence. Clara noticed. One night, as we washed dishes together, she touched my arm, her eyes searching. "Annika, is everything okay? You've been so quiet lately." I forced a smile, the lie bitter on my tongue. "I'm fine, Mom, just swamped with school." She hugged me, her warmth a reminder of all I stood to lose. "Don't work too hard, sweetheart, I miss you," she said, and guilt stabbed through me like a shard of glass. Elias noticed too. I'd catch him watching me, his brow furrowed as if trying to solve a puzzle. One evening, as the sky burned orange beyond the cliffs, he knocked on my bedroom door. "Annika," he said, his voice gentle but laced with worry. "Can we talk?" My heart thudded, too loud in the quiet room. I didn't want to face him, didn't want to risk what might spill out if I did. But his tone, soft and earnest, pulled me to the door. I opened it slowly, and there he stood, his grey-blue eyes searching mine. "I've noticed you've been pulling away," he said, his hands in his pockets, his posture careful. "If I've done something to upset you, I'd like to know. I want you to feel okay here with us." His concern was a knife twisting in my chest. I wanted to tell him it wasn't his fault, that it was me, my heart, my betrayal, but the words caught in my throat, tangled in fear and shame. "It's not you," I managed, my voice shaking. "It's just school stress." He nodded, but his eyes lingered as if he could see the truth I was hiding. "I'm here if you need me," he said, and turned away, leaving me alone with the weight of what I couldn't say.